Hi there, and welcome back to the last of the Global History video lectures. Now, after you get done cheering, I'm going to let you know that today we are going to be talking about global issues and concerns. These are all issues that have occurred and will be occurring throughout your lifetime on a global scale. Not things that just Americans have to deal with, but everyone all across the world, things that we are going to have to deal with, problems that we are going to need to solve. So let's start first by talking about some environmental issues. You've probably heard of these kinds of issues before, as they are all over the news. Let's look at just a couple of these, starting with pollution. Pollution is considered to be any kind of contamination to the environment. Oftentimes it's caused by fossil fuels being things like coal, oil, and natural gas. Pollution can cause many different types of diseases and even death. And so let's look at some different kinds of pollution, starting with acid rain. Acid rain occurs when polluted water falls during a rainstorm. Again, like with all the causes of pollution we talked about before, these are due to the burning of fossil fuels. And acid rain causes damage to forests, lakes, farmland, and even buildings. It can even impact drinking water. Today, international agreements have been made to reduce emissions that cause acid rain. The picture that you see here is how acid rain affects stonework on a building. The one on the left-hand side was taken in 1908, and just 60 years later, you can see that much of the detail is gone due to acid rain. Next is the depletion of the ozone layer. The ozone layer is a layer of gases that protects the Earth from the sun's damaging UV rays. And the use of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and other chemicals causes that layer to deplete. And there's actually a physical hole in the ozone layer that can be seen in these pictures. The effects of the depletion of the ozone layer include things like skin cancer and eye disease due to radiation, crop damage, damage to marine life, and global warming. Global warming, also known as the greenhouse effect, occurs when warmer air gets trapped in the lower atmosphere, and this is usually due to the sun's UV rays, and this causes a gradual rise in global temperatures. Now, we have throughout history gone through periods of warming and cooling, the ice ages, and then the warming of the earth. But this is more than that. Due to the use of fossil fuels and the destruction of forests, you can actually see the world's temperature starting to rise. Now, in the middle of winter, that might not seem true, but it has overall effects, including negative impacts on agriculture, and which changes in growing seasons, the shrinking of the ice caps, that is the glaciers on both the North and South Pole, which has caused the oceans to flood and sea levels to rise, causing cities that are on the coast to actually experience loss of land, and the extinction of plants and animals. Now, in 1997 and again in 2010, the UN met to set limits on emissions, and it said that certain countries were allowed to emit only a certain amount of gases. The biggest emitters of these gases that cause global warming are the U.S. and China has actually not kept to its limits. And in some cases, the U.S. doesn't either. And what some of these countries have been able to do is actually buy some of the emissions. So where the UN has set limits, when a country doesn't use all of their emissions, countries like the U.S. and China can actually buy those unused emissions, and therefore they can put out more than they have been set to by the UN. This is a picture of the ice caps. Somewhere between 1979 and 1981, and then again in 2007, and you can see the difference in the amount of ice that has been melted due to global warming. One of the biggest reasons for the greenhouse effect is actually deforestation. Deforestation occurs when so like it sounds, forests are cut down, sometimes for use as lumber and other times to clear land for development. And a lot of people ask, why do we allow this to happen? Why do we allow these forests, especially the tropical rainforests, which are in many cases unexplored? Why do these countries allow it to happen? And the biggest reason is many of these nations are developing nations and they need that income. When these forests are cut down, it does more than just takes away the homes for animals. It changes weather patterns. It allows for a buildup of carbon dioxide, which contributes to the greenhouse effect. Soil erosion occurs because the root systems aren't there to keep the soil in place. And as I mentioned before, plant and animal extinction. The second one is desertification. Desertification occurs when, due to a change in climate, land becomes more desert-like. And the Sahara has seen this process of desertification over centuries. And for a long time it's been very gradual, inches per year. But that is slowly starting to increase as our climate starts to change. And nuclear waste. Nuclear waste has an impact. It doesn't seem like one of those things that it would directly affect you, but it does. And nuclear waste is left over from decades ago when nuclear energy was something that people thought was going to be like the next big thing. Since its development, there's actually been two major nuclear accidents, one in 1986 at the Chernobyl power plant in the Soviet Union. And from this map you can see the increased radiation dose that occurred not just in Chernobyl, which is still to this day unlivable, but hundreds of miles away you can see this impact of the radiation. In 2011 there was yet another. During a tsunami, Japanese power plants went into a meltdown, which caused nuclear waste to be spread out in the oceans during this tsunami. Now, initially waste was dumped into oceans or buried, and we've now learned since then that just increases the exposure to nuclear radiation. Plants, animals, and human exposure to radiation leads to radiation poisoning, cancer, and birth defects. This is an example of a cow that was exposed to radiation. The same kind of deformities can be seen in humans as well. Since all of this, they've tried to take steps to stop exposure to nuclear waste by banning dumping and burying, and many nations have scaled back their nuclear programs. Up next is war and peace. We've talked about a couple of these, but let's just refresh our memories on some of the peacekeeping organizations. This is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that included many of the Western democratic nations. Its sort of opposite was the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc, and the other communist nations. This is SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and then probably the most well-known today is the UN. And you'll notice that most nations in the world are members of the United Nations. And one of the biggest things that the UN deals with today are peacekeeping operations. And we've talked about some of them, and we'll continue to talk about more in just a moment. But one of the things I want to talk about now is weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction include nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and even biological weapons. As part of the UN agreement, only certain nations are allowed to have nuclear weapons. The 5 declared nuclear powers include the US, Russia, China, Great Britain, and France. As part of the Cold War, though, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was an agreement to scale back these nuclear weapons. This idea that if we went to war and used nuclear weapons, essentially it would annihilate the world. And people began to realize that. So in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, and this continued in the 1970s with SALT. On this map, you can see the nuclear weapons development status represented by color as of March of 2007. The red indicate the 5 nuclear weapons states. The orange, though, are other known nuclear powers. These are powers that were not agreed upon to be allowed to have nuclear weapons. The purple states are the areas that formally possessed nuclear weapons. The yellow are states that are suspected of being in the process of developing some kind of nuclear weapons program. The blue are states which at one point had nuclear weapons or weapons programs, research programs. And pink are states that possess nuclear weapons but not have widely adopted them. And you'll notice that the only one there is North Korea. The undeclared nuclear powers, as you saw on that map, are India, Pakistan, and Israel. And the issues between India and Pakistan have led to some issues between the two, especially since they both have access to nuclear weapons programs. Those that have nuclear weapons efforts that are attempting to make nuclear weapons are Iran, North Korea, and various terrorist groups. Let's take a look now at overpopulation. This map shows not the size of the area of each individual country, but the countries that are proportional to their population. And you'll notice that places like India and China are very much skewed in this map due to their overpopulation. As a response to this, China has established something that actually a lot of people know, and that's the one-child policy. The one-child policy was established by Deng Xiaoping as what he called a temporary measure. And the reason that this was put into place is because you remember in a communist country, everything is provided for the people, which means as their population began to increase, that meant the government had to feed and clothe everybody. The one-child policy, while it started out as a one-child policy, it's best stated really as one is best, two at most, but never a third child policy. And it enacts economic incentives for couples who have only one child, like things like tax breaks. And if you have more than one, then you might see a fine, even forced sterilization, or pressure to abort any pregnancies after the first. Because of China's size and its differences between varying parts of the country, it's not as widely carried out in rural areas as it is in cities. There's more flexibility in rural areas where you see it more of an agricultural society where children are needed to do things like work on farms and take care of the elderly. But in cities like in Beijing, where space is an issue, you'll see the one-child policy carried out more rigorously. Because of the cultural background of China, there's always been sort of an idea of female inferiority. And in fact, in Chinese culture, a woman is not considered to be a woman until she has a male child. And this causes problems because of the one-child policy. It's led to abortion, especially of those pregnancies that they found out that they were going to have a girl. It's led to neglect and abandonment on the part of female children, and even infanticide, that is the killing of female babies. It's also had more of a long-term effect because the normal male to female ratio throughout the world is 105 to 100, which means that for every 105 males, there are 100 women. If you were coupling everybody out, that would leave 5 men without a wife. But in China, that ratio is closer to 114 to 100. Which means that 14 men no longer have wives. And this is where you see actually Chinese men doing these like kind of mail order brides so that they have a wife. The government widely practices contraception, giving out contraception to people to kind of keep their rising population down. The long-term problem that we're seeing now, though, is that while their population is starting to shrink, their age is starting to rise, and there are more elderly per young people. This leaves this growing elderly population with no one to take care of them. The Green Revolution is actually a response to the population issues that we've had over the past 100 years. As population started to increase in the 1950s and 60s, there was a threat of famine, worldwide famine. So this growing population meant that there was a need for increased food production. And to increase this food production, they enacted new types of technology, pesticides, fertilizers, high yield, and disease resistant crops to help increase food production. The problem with all of these things is that pesticides and these chemicals lead to pollution. Many of the chemicals and the equipment needed to produce these things are very costly, which means that small farms are driven out of business and more commercial farms are being used. The other issue is this idea of a gene revolution. That is genetically modifying plants or GMOs to be more disease resistant or produce higher yield crops without the need for chemicals. And there's been a big push over the recent decades for non-GMO types of plants because we don't know the outcomes of ingesting these kinds of foods. Human rights issues. Going back to 1948, after the Holocaust, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted by the UN. This said that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Later, it was also specified that freedom of movement and freedom to publish and exchange info were also included in this. Now, this is not a binding declaration. It's people, countries have to agree to it. Some examples of human rights violations throughout history include the Holocaust, the extermination of the Jews by the Nazi Germans, the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot, where he killed off millions during the Vietnam War time period, the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, which was a reaction by the Chinese government under Deng Xiaoping against pushes for democracy. Apartheid, that is sort of this idea of the black majority being inferior to the white minority in South Africa, and its abolishment under Nelson Mandela. The Hutus and the Tutsis, which we talked about when we watched Hotel Rwanda, that ethnic genocide of the Tutsis by the Hutus as a response to decolonization. You also see women's status in parts of the world being persecuted during this time. And in 2000, the UN reported under the Progress of World's Women that there is still a significant difference between the way women are treated versus the way that men are treated. There was progress in the 1990s in equality in education and in employment, but gender inequality still exists. And you can see this especially in Middle Eastern Islamic nations. For example, in Afghanistan and Iran, where more fundamentalist types of Islam is practiced, women are forced to wear the hijab. That is the garment that covers basically everything but your hands, feet, and eyes. Some people say that this is a form of discrimination, while actually many women say that this is something that they feel comfortable in. Additionally, you'll see things called stonings or honor killings. Amnesty International found in April and May of 2005, 4 women were killed in 2 separate incidents in northern Afghanistan, and this is just a small example of this kinds of things happening. In late April, a 29-year-old woman from northeastern Afghanistan was killed, allegedly by family members, following the decision by the local religious council to sentence her to death by stoning, where they found her guilty of adultery. And stoning is where they would throw stones at you until you were basically beaten to death. Oftentimes this is some kind of response to things like adultery, that is them cheating or trying to leave their husbands, or in some cases even being raped, because that is seen as a a mark on the family. And lastly, health issues. The biggest health issue that we're facing today is the AIDS epidemic. AIDS really came to light in the 1980s. Today, 70% of HIV sufferers actually live in sub-Saharan Africa. And the top map that you see there shows HIV prevalence based on numbers. And you'll notice that Africa is very much skewed because of this. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, in 2002, 6,500 people died a day due to this, and most of that was between the ages of 15 and 49. And this has a severe impact, economically speaking, because these are working age people, and this is going to impact their economy. So that's it for today. Thank you very much.